An era, or two, come to a close on Segaiden episode 76. The Sega Master System's run in Japan, as the Mark III, comes to a close here at the end of 1988. Even though the system still has a lot of years of life left in the US, and especially in Europe and Brazil. But then, change was pretty much in the air around this time in Japan. Just a few weeks before the final Mark III cartridge hit shelves, a new era began in Japan. These facts are unrelated, as the era thing was a whole lot bigger than the discontinuation of an unpopular game console, but the larger change really does feel like it trickled down into every facet of that society. Specifically, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito died at the beginning of January 1989 to become enshrined in history as the Emperor Showa. His son ascended to the chrysanthemum throne, and the Heisei era began. The association between calendar ages and imperial reigns makes these eras of the Japanese calendar wholly unique to that culture, and as with so many things that happen a little differently in Japan, the country seems to collectively place a great deal of cultural significance on them. Maybe more, now that the emperor serves a strictly ceremonial role, than in the centuries in which the emperor actually ruled the country in a meaningful way, honestly. In fact, that transition happened during the reign of Hirohito, who has the distinction of being Japan's longest ruling monarch. He reigned during Japan's era of imperial militarism and led the country into World War II. And among Japan's post-war concessions upon their surrender was the fact that the emperor would become a symbolic figurehead rather than an actual ruler. But it also means that, newly powerless as he may have been, Hirohito continued to sit during Japan's recovery and reconstruction in the wake of the war. By the time he passed, his nation had become one of the world's leading economies and a powerhouse of both technological and cultural exports. Buoyed by financial strength that would have seemed inconceivable in the bleak days of the late 1940s. Anyway, a lot changed in Japan around the time of Hirohito's passing. The bubble economy would soon burst due to overextended real estate speculation, among other things. Key cultural figures, like defining manga artist Osamu Tezuka, would pass. The civil unrest of the 1960s would start to creep back in around the edges of society, as with the Aum Shinrikyo sarin gas attack of 1995. And the rise of the aimless hikikomori subculture denied the prosperous future their parents had enjoyed due to the country's economic struggles. And yeah, the Mark III shut down to make way for a 16-bit generation of consoles. Kind of small potatoes in the grand scheme of things, I realize, but it happened. Anyway, I mention all of this not only as an epitaph for Sega's 8-bit line in Japan after its promising, but ultimately unfulfilled 5-year run, but also because these two Japan-exclusive releases feel very much like Showa-era relics. You can see that right here with the box art for Nekkyu Koshien, yet another 8-bit baseball game amidst the infinite flood of 8-bit baseball games. This one features a very old-school, painterly image on its box, which ties it closely to the middle-late Showa era. Mark III owners hadn't really seen a lot of this style on their game boxes. And in a way, Nekkyu Koshien's box brings Sega's 8-bit family full circle. The SG-1000 library made use of this type of box art extensively in its early days, before the Western-style commercial art look gave way to manga and anime influences. So it seems fitting to bring back that vibe here at the end of the SG-1000 family's run. The game contents likewise reflect the overall ethos of the Showa era. The assimilation of Western influences given a distinctly Japanese twist. Actually, baseball had been popular in Japan since long before even Hirohito's assumption of the throne. But this particular baseball game doesn't focus on professional leagues, rather, it looks at high school baseball, and as a result, its presentation style feels very different from the usual baseball titles that Americans would be familiar with. Everything from the scoreboards to the cheering section differ radically from MLB, and you can understand why Sega didn't bother localizing it. As a simulation of baseball mechanics, Nekkyu Koshien does absolutely nothing new or interesting that a dozen other 8-bit baseball titles hadn't already done before. Aside from the juvenile stature of its players, it's pretty much just baseball. A graphically decent baseball game, sure, but utterly unremarkable. However, Nekkyu Koshien stands out for its enthusiastic embrace of Japanese high school baseball. It has a slightly rowdy vibe, with cutaway shots a couple of times per inning, that showcase the lively spirit of the event. Sometimes you see a crowd shot, with spectators forming fighting words. Sometimes you'll see the uniform-clad Oendan cheer squad banging away at taiko drums. And sometimes the cutaway shows off the cheerleaders, which, to my recollection, are not a thing you see at American baseball games of any sort. This is a digital rendition of the most decidedly Japanese interpretation of the sport. One that takes an import pastime and turns it into something distinct from its treatment anywhere else in the world. It's still 8-bit baseball, mind you, but it has a personality, which is more than you can say for most examples of the genre. Nekkyu Koshien must have looked pretty retro sitting on store shelves in 1988, what with its outdated 1970s style box art. But I imagine it still seemed more timely than Tensai Bakabon, a game based on a comic from the 1960s. Every once in a while, a game comes across my desk based on some sort of Japanese pop cultural institution that means absolutely nothing to me, and whose popularity seems utterly incomprehensible. For every Chibi Maruko-chan or Fist of the North Star where you can see the appeal, there's at least one bewildering Tensai Bakabon. Based on a comic by Fujio Akatsuka, who, despite his name and art style, has nothing to do with the manga team behind Doraemon, Fujiko F. Fujio, Tensai Bakabon centers on the family of a delinquent kid with a high-achieving younger sibling and an idiot father. The series takes its name from the delinquent, Bakabon, but over time his father became more popular among readers, and so stories began to center on him rather than on the property's namesake. This sounds to me a bit like the same path that The Simpsons would take, with its gradual focal drift from Bart to Homer. And based on my limited exposure to the series from this game, I don't think that comparison would be entirely off the mark. The narrative momentum here seems to be fueled by a combination of the protagonist's innate laziness and stupidity, and the weirdos who live around them. Except that the characters and their designs are much weirder and more grotesque than anything Matt Groening ever came up with. His amateurish comics art had its edges sanded off and reworked into an appealing template for character designs by the time The Simpsons made the leap from The Tracy Ullman Show to its own primetime vehicle, whereas Akatsuka's designs are unrepentantly hideous. And I guess that's the appeal, just a bunch of stupid, horrible freaks living in a small Japanese town and having comically wretched misadventures. Coincidentally, though, I think another Groening character summed it up best.
Tell them I hate them!
It's actually kind of a weird choice for a 1988 Mark III release. Whereas other vintage manga properties that surfaced as 8-bit games almost always did so as a tie-in with a current or recent anime adaptation, Sega published Tensai Bakabon in the midst of a lacuna for the property. This franchise had been absent for nearly a decade in 1988. While a new animated adaptation would arrive a few years later, by that point, the Mark III would be dead and buried, and no one would be able to buy a copy of Sega's Tensai Bakabon unless they stumbled across new old stock, piled up in some shabby little secondhand shop in one of the dingier back alleys of Din Din Town or whatever. Weird choice for a license. But as for the game, I do think it makes a kind of sense if you look at it as the companion piece to Hoshio Sagashite. What I mean by that is that pretty much everyone who worked on Phantasy Star followed that project immediately by delving into creating an adventure game. Rieko Kodama and several other artists and programmers created Hoshio Sagashite, while nearly everyone else shifted to Tensai Bakabon instead. The two games represent very different takes on the adventure genre. Hoshio Sagashite plays more or less like a visual novel, with gameplay consisting entirely of windowed spaces and menu-based inputs. Tensai Bakabon does incorporate menus, but only once you initiate conversation with another character. For the most part, you play as Bakabon's papa and have direct control over the character, meaning that it resembles, though rarely actually plays like, a platform action game. Papa can run, jump, and kick. While you mostly spend your time wandering around town in a small loop, chatting with people in search of Papa's youngest son, Hajime, who's gone missing, you do occasionally have to engage in a moderate amount of platforming and pixel hunting in order to drum up the cash you need in order to buy and bribe your way towards your goal. There is no direct combat to be found in Tensai Bakabon, at least not to the point that I managed to reach. Papa's kick really just allows him to interact with the backgrounds and occasionally reveal cash or other objects. That's not to say the game doesn't include any sort of conflict, but the scuffles that Papa gets into unfold entirely through menus. When you encounter another character, you usually chat for a bit before seeing a menu with 3 options. You can ask about Hajime's whereabouts, fight, or show or give that person an item from your inventory. The fights play out automatically, and they have predetermined outcomes. For example, you can always count on being able to pound a bunch of cash from one guy, but you'll absolutely never win a fistfight against the Yakuza guy. The entire game unfolds in a pretty straightforward fashion. You walk around, encounter characters, and collect clues toward finding Hajime by performing tasks. Some of these are straightforward, such as the fact that Bakabon wants a burger, which you can buy from Donathan's. It's like McDonald's, but also Jonathan's. Others are more esoteric, like the mole you need to find in a cave, then attempt to fight several times before you finally manage to win and extract a crucial secret from him. It is, in other words, a fairly arbitrary game full of trial and error. But again, par for the course. It's much less charming and story-driven than Hoshio Sagashite, but that seems to be in keeping with the source material, which revolves around idiot characters having dumb misadventures and ridiculous interactions with other morons. The game contains a lot of freaks taken straight from the comics, ranging from a violent policeman to a sort of eel creature rendered with a distressingly minstrel-adjacent look. It's no classic, but I guess as video game adaptations of outdated manga properties go, you could certainly have done worse in the 8-bit era. Anyway, the game had the last laugh here. I assumed it didn't have a fan translation available since I couldn't find one in my collection of ROM hacks, but I was mistaken. ROMhacking.net has a fan translation from about a year and a half ago, available for download, a bit more recently than I compiled my resources for this series. So if for some reason you need to play Tensai Bakabon, say for a video retrospective on your YouTube channel, you needn't suffer through it in a foreign language the way that I did. Nope, now you can suffer through it in English instead. Lucky you. Next time on Segaiden, let's see what 1989 has in store for us.